This tiny pill could mean life or death. You trust it. You believe it will heal. You place your hope in it. But what if I told you this pill is a lie? What if I told you instead of curing, it kills? Fake drugs are everywhere, in pharmacies, shelves, in hospital dispensaries, even in the hands of desperate families trying to save a loved one. Expired, repackaged, and sold with deadly intent. A billion-naira industry built on deception, thriving on pain, and leaving a trail of corpses in its wake. Last week, 10 trucks of deadly fake drugs were seized in Onitsha. Counterfeit antibiotics, toxic anti-malarial pills, and fake BP meds. NAFDAC found machines wiping expiry dates, arrested criminals, and rejected a 135 million naira bribe, blood money to keep the killing going. But how did these drugs flood the market in the first place? Was there any oversight? What's the regulatory body doing about it? The enforcement that was done before the lives were put at risk. In Lagos, over 3,000 drug shops were shut down. Seized vaccines stored in filth, banned injections, expired meds set for revalidation, and stolen HIV drugs. 12 more trucks of poison were cleared, including hidden codeine and tramadol 225. Silent killers waiting to strike. But shutting down rogue pharmacies is not enough. Who granted them licenses? Who allowed these poisons to be imported, distributed, and sold under the government's watch? Search your conscience. How many mothers have buried their children because of greed? How many fathers have watched their wives gasp for breath because the inhaler was a fraud? And yet these merchants of death walk among us. They smile in their homes. They eat from their blood-stained hands. But do they sleep? Do they hear the cries of those they have murdered in silence of the night? Do they dream of the babies who will never grow up because they swallowed a lie? The time of silence is over. We must demand accountability, not just from the criminals producing and selling fake drugs, but from those in government who have allowed this rot to fester. Where are the reforms? Where's the urgency? Where's the leadership? Fake drugs is a bullet in the body of our nation, and if we do nothing about it, we're complicit. And to those who fight against this horror, stand firm. The lives of millions depend on it. The question remains, how much is a human life worth? To some, it's worth a few naira notes crumpled in a back alley deal. To the rest of us, it should be priceless. Good morning, Nigeria.
Very, very sad realities that we have to deal with as to the impact of fake drugs. And we hope that these questions hit hard home and that we can reflect on them. Let's now move the conversation away to look at Nigeria's headline inflation rate that has seen a sharp drop from 34.80% in December 2024 to 24.48% year-on-year in January 2025. The National Bureau of Statistics (NBS) says that the cost of the deduction is from the rebased consumer price index, that is the CPI. The Statistician-General of the Federation, Adeyemi Adeniran, explained that urban inflation stood at 26.09%, while rural inflation was recorded at 22.15%. Also, the CPI rebasing aligns with international standards, capturing updated consumer spending patterns. Now, here's what you should know.
The CPI rebasing contains the recent consumption patterns and national economic realities. Food inflation also reduced to 26.08% compared to 39.84% in December. Core inflation, which removes the prices on food and energy, is now at 22.59%. The CBN Governor Yemi Cardoso has also restated his efforts to curb inflation and stabilize Nigeria's economy. Join us this morning to discuss this drop in inflation is the co-founder of Veriv Africa, Basil Abia. Good morning to you, Basil, from the nation's capital, Abuja. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Benga, and good morning, Olive. A pleasure to join New Central this morning.
Now, Basil, the NBS has released the rebased CPI, which has led to a significant reported drop in the inflation rate. Now, for the average Nigerian, can you explain this, how this rebasing affects inflation figures and what it means to us?
Yeah, it's quite easy to explain from an economic or technical term, but I'll try to break it down to everyday Nigerians. So NBS is changing how it calculates inflation. Inflation basically is the calculation of the movement or the rate of movement of price year on year and month on month based on a particular price reference and weight reference period. So in this context, price reference period would be the period that they do the baseline survey to calculate all of the price changes. And then weight reference is the weight methodology for certain subcomponents of the inflation calculation. And one way to be able to explain that is that the National Bureau of Statistics are using 2023 as the weight reference period. They're using 2023 as the weight reference period because they carried out a livelihood survey, basically sampling households to see how much their expenditure on certain things are and what their consumption patterns are currently. And that meant that they had to change the weighting for food, for instance, from 51%, which was the old weighting methodology for inflation, to over 40%. They also reduced that of housing expenditure when it comes to water, electricity, gas, and other fuels in households. And that weighting reduced by over 100%, from 16.7% to over 8.4%. So basically, the reason why inflation has reduced in the context of the new rebased CPI report is that they have reduced the weighting of the largest contributors to inflation, which is food, food component, like I told you, reduced to 40%, and also water, gas, housing, energy, and other fuels that are consumed in households. So the reduction of these two major contributors have ensured that we're seeing headline inflation rates reduced to 24.48%.
What year? Just to clarify, what's the base year for the rebasing? Because that was also a subject of controversy in the past few weeks when the conversation about rebasing the economy came up. And do you agree with the base year that was used?
Well, the base year is 2024. This is again, these are international best practices. But let me say this to answer your question directly. International best practices are global reference points. Local economies, local governance actors can either take this as suggestions and adhere to them, or they can use methods that are peculiar to their own macroeconomic environment. So in this context, I still, just like I did months ago when I was asked this question on New Central specifically, that I don't agree with the choice of 2024 as the price reference period, largely because of the context of volatility. Sometimes you have to be able to use nuance. And macroeconomic records, especially from a statistical point, you want to be able to pick stable periods that you use as your price reference period. Weight reference periods, I don't have any issue with it, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're increasing the number of composite price products that you're observing for their price changes. And that increased from over 740 to exactly 936 price products that they were observing. It also included that they had to carry out a household survey, living standard survey. And that obviously saw that, according to that data, household expenditure for food reduced on average from 51% to over 40%. So that is not an issue for me, and that's not an issue for a lot of analysts. But what a lot of analysts and economists that I've been speaking with over the last 1 month, what they're concerned with the new rebased CPI methodology is that the price reference period using 2024 is very volatile, significantly high. Our record high inflation on average for the year was recorded in 2024. Our record high food inflation rate was also recorded in 2024. If you use that as your price reference period, what it causes is an artificial distortion of the inflationary trend, because that is the peak period. and since that is your peak alpha or your peak zero, you're going to use that as your reference. So if there is an inflection, which is in this sense a reduction in the rate of inflation over time, what happens is that the price reflection in the CPI doesn't accurately tell the story of inflation of the country.
So what should have been a better year?
You are seeing
what should have been a more accurate year if 2024, if analysts argue that 2024 wasn't a great year to use, for the rebasing? What should have been a better year?
A lot of people keep saying 2019, and I will toe to that line. 2019 was obviously the most stable year for the last 4 years. So why pick the most unstable year? 2019, of course, was just before the pandemic in 2020, and we know, of course, 2020 was really, really distorted in terms of the pandemic. That's also the period where Nigeria experienced a second recession. There was also a global recession and a global inflationary bust that trickled into the Nigeria's macroeconomic environment in 2021, when we had that large surge in headline inflation, especially food inflation in that context.
Now, Basil, looking ahead, what strategies should the Nigerian government use or adopt to ensure that inflation remains under control? Because many businesses have been adjusting their prices frequently due to economic stability. What do they need to do to stabilize the economy?
So from the short-term perspective, we need to be able to pump oil to about 1.8 million barrels per day on average. We are currently doing 1.5 million barrels. I know that certain government actors want to believe that we should hold on to the 1.8 million barrels lie by the NUPRC, but that is because they're adding condensates to that mix. If you remove condensates and just use pure oil production numbers, it's 1.5 million barrels, and that's just not enough. Let me also give you context that a significant chunk of the crude oil that we're producing goes into repaying or servicing debts, because there are a number of resource-driven or crude-driven debt financing that we're able to access, especially the NMPC, we're able to access to enable carry out some trade as well as some other economic actions. Now, outside of that, outside of the pumping of the oil, and what that does is because a significant driver too, another significant driver for inflation in Nigeria is exchange rate pass-through. Now, macroeconomists call exchange rate pass-through when the exchange rate is very expensive. That passes through to consumer goods, and like you see, aggregate prices of consumer goods get increased. A typical example is when you're trying to buy foreign used cars. Because the exchange rate is really high, parallel market rate is around 1,500, and now, of course, there's some form of uniformity too in the official foreign exchange market rate, which is around 1,570 naira per dollar. Because of how expensive that is in relative terms, it means that you are having to buy sedans at almost 10 million naira, in some contexts 10 million naira, because of course they have to be imported. So this is a typical example of what macroeconomists would explain as exchange rate pass-through. So one way to be able to curtail or get the naira to appreciate is if you pump more oil, and pump more oil so that you can offset the losses you get from the crude that you're staking to service the debts, the crude-led debts that we already have access to. Now, moving forward, still within the medium term, we have to be able to get food production numbers up, and also try and see how we can augment for some losses or some offsets by complementing with more syndicated food imports as well in that context. So
Basil, as quickly as you can.
You're seeing
yeah, because I'd like you to quickly, we're almost out of time. This number, 24.48%, a number of Nigerians don't seem to agree with it, but it is the official stats that the NBS has released. And people say they haven't yet started to see the impact. But are there any merits to these numbers? Can we say maybe you will bring in, foreign investment? Are there any positive signs that we can see from these numbers?
Maybe the only positive, and you have to look at it again from a macro perspective, probably the only positive here is that it's going to make the CBN Monetary Policy Committee calm down with their hikes a bit. Now that the numbers are out, like of course, The 199th Monetary Policy Committee meeting starts today in Abuja, in the Central Bank of Nigeria headquarters. Yeah, they will probably hold on to hiking, so they will not hike the interest rates. They will hold it to the current rate, which is 27.5%. That is some form of relief for the real sector, folks in the financial services, as well as folks who are in the industrial sector. Like you know, of course, the largest contributor to Nigeria's GDP at over 53% is the services sector. And then another significant driver to Nigeria's GDP is also the industry sector. So now the industry sector have to be able to access naira-based liquidity from the Nigerian financial services. And because inflation rate is high and the interest rate is at 27.5%, a further hike in interest rate means that, or a further hike in the monetary policy rate means that interest rates that they're going to access from financial services will be very high. But a halt means that when they're accessing naira-based liquidity, especially bridge loans or short-term loans to be able to carry out a transaction or pay for certain imported raw materials to continue to manufacture, they no longer have to pay a higher price. So that form of halt gives some relief to the industry sector. So if we're looking at positives, probably the only positive is that the real sector would have some form of relief.
Thank you so much for your insight and time, Basil Abia, co-founder of Veriv Africa. We do appreciate your insight and your time.